When you think about how to summarize the book of Hebrews, its name is a good place to start. The book is a marvelous account of the promises God gave to the Hebrew people in the Old Testament, and how God's Son, Jesus Christ, is their fulfillment. So let's start by laying out some of these connections. All of the scriptures were written to point to God's righteousness and faithfulness to His people in sending His Son, Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of our sin. In the opening chapter of Hebrews, the author quotes 7 different Old Testament passages that pointed to God sending His Son. A central figure in the Old Testament is Moses. And while the writings of Moses were important, Hebrews recognized that Christ is even more important. Moses' role, ultimately, was to testify to the promise of Christ. That's a critical role. As the book of Hebrews identifies, faith in that promise is the red thread running through all of the Old Testament. By faith, Abel's sacrifice to God was more acceptable than Cain's. By faith, Noah constructed the ark. By faith, Abraham heard and obeyed God. By faith, Sarah conceived a baby at a very old age. By faith, Moses led the enslaved Israelites out of Egypt. That's just the first 2 books of the Bible. A long list of the faithful follows in the rest of the Old Testament, such as Gideon, Samson, David, Samuel, and the prophets. They all trusted God's promise of Christ, which made them pleasing to God. Nothing they did, and no matter their role, it was entirely faith in the hope of the promised Christ that commended them to God. Hebrews understands that this message must be continually proclaimed, lest we drift away from it. That message is that Christ was sent by the Father to deal with our sin. In dealing with sin, Jesus took over the role of the Jewish high priest who made sacrifices in the temple. The difference is that the sacrifices made by the Old Testament priests did not clean the conscience of the worshiper because they were appointed by men. Jesus, on the other hand, was sent by God. He entered into our sin and death, and He finally ended all sacrifices with His own body and blood on the cross and in the resurrection. Much like a high priest, Jesus certainly offered up prayers and supplications for the sin of the world. But Christ's sacrificial death was once and for all. It was the final atonement for all sin. As the book of Hebrews explains, when Jesus handed over His body and blood to sinners at the crucifixion, a New Testament was established. The testament is much like a person making out their last will and testament. In order for a last will and testament to go into effect and deliver the inheritance to their heirs, the one making the testament must die. When Jesus died on the cross, He tasted death for us, so that through death, He destroyed the power of death. And He did this for the people God gave Him. One of the ways God delivers that message is through the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. Hebrews is clear that Jesus handed over His body and blood in His crucifixion and resurrection as a last will and testament for the forgiveness of our sin. He did so once and for all to defeat sin fully by defeating the consequence of sin, death itself.